Okay. So anyway, good evening. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting us to this conversation. It's really interesting to see these different directions and origins of feminism. Well, it's slightly more difficult for me because I'm talking about the whole continent, Latin America. And as you know, there has been a lot of discussion about if Latin America can even be discussed as such because it's such a diverse place. And so the first thing I would like to say is that it's not possible really to discuss feminism in a unified way in Latin America. You really need to talk about Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela. Every single one of them has a singular way in which feminism can be seen and has a different history of militancy and artistic practice. The other thing is that really, despite the fact that in Latin America there has been basically from the 19th century a lot of kind of feminist pursuits and militancy for many things, voting rights and so forth, really it hasn't been the same in art. The relationship, like for example, we're used to see in European and North American art, where there is a very strong kind of feminist art practice together with the feminist militancy, is really not the case in Latin America. The exception is Mexico. In Mexico, there was both coming together at the same time. Also, on the other hand, really is not until the 1970s or 80s that feminism flourishes more openly. And I wanted to say that feminism has actually encountered a lot of prejudice, and there were many reasons why feminism was also rejected and particularly difficult. It was seen by the left as agents of the Yankee imperialism. In Latin America, there has been a real paranoia, especially in the 60s and 70s, against imperialism. And it was often seen as a bourgeois enterprise. Middle-class women had nothing to do. They weren't struggling for their lives, and they had maids at home. They were struggling for some sort of something else. And also the right saw the feminism as criminal abortionists, and the mass media saw them as lesbian anti-males. So really they were completely stuck in this kind of really situation of total prejudiced vision. And I really, the reason why I'm working on and discussing this issue now is because about 5 years ago I started to work on large research with another colleague, Andrea Giunta, about radical women practices in Latin America. We started from the 1940s onwards to the 1980s, and then we decided to focus in the 1960s. The real reason why we started to do this exercise is because in the same way when I started in the 80s history of art, and I found that there were hardly any Latin American artists in the art history books, when you look at the generation 2, 20, 30 years down the line, there is very few women in the art history books, and especially in the art history books of Latin America. And it is absolutely clear that there is a huge amount of absolutely wonderful women artists. For example, you have countries like Brazil, where Brazil has had some of the most emblematic artists of the 20th century are women, like Tarsila do Amaral, Anita Malfatti, Ligia Clark. But in other countries, it hasn't been the case. You may think of Mexico, someone like Frida Kahlo. But in some cases, really, it hasn't, it is only kind of the tip of the iceberg, and that has actually stood for the whole. And I feel that in Latin America, basically, often people have simply not asked the question, where are the women artists? And the more I ask, the more women I find. And so it's quite amazing. For me, when I actually saw the exhibition of Anita, I was, how can Anita be? I always forget how to pronounce her surname. Shapochnikov. How could someone so absolutely wonderful could have been hidden away from art history for so long? So I'm not surprised about this. So basically, because people, the first question I've been asked again and again with a lot of resistance is why women? Why an exhibition of only women? There have been enough exhibitions about women, and this is an exhibition about feminist art, and feminist exhibitions should not only include male. And I would agree with that. I mean, I think feminism is something that belongs to both women and men. It doesn't belong only to men. But this is not really an exhibition about feminist art. And there is hundreds of reasons why I think basically, the first thing is that there has been a historical vacuum, and the fact that these were women, there was a lot more resistance to their presence and to their acknowledgement. So that's, and people consider a feminist activity to actually give visibility to women. I would accept that that may be the case. Lucy Lippard may define feminism as helping other women, may be the case. But the thing is, when you boil down to the actual trying to find that if really you can denominate a lot of these artists as feminists, I mean, I would like, and afterward, to have a conversation amongst us about some of the works I've seen here. Literally, I mean, there is a lot of resistance. Women simply do not consider themselves feminists. And I would like to show you some examples so that we can actually see some of this. And of course, for most of, is it this one? In most of these cases, so basically, there has been, one of the things that has happened in Latin America, there has been somehow a kind of a difference between the feminist cause and the social causes of social movements in Latin America. There is a huge amount of social movement in the sense there is, for example, this is Madre de la Plaza de Mayo, which is when all the women disappeared during the dictatorship and then Luz Donoso also. These are basically, one of them is an artist and one is not. One is a kind of a street action that happened. And then, for example, these are two artists from Chile that Nelly Richa, who is a really wonderful feminist theoretician from Chile, she's tried to kind of read some of these images of feminists. But, you know, basically, if you were to think of the dictatorship as one of the huge development of a patriarchal society, then yeah, of course. I mean, you can see, and you know, she reads in terms of the words as being the male and the body of this thing, and this kind of distortion and gauze is applied to this as the female, and this kind of subversion of the content and the dictatorship of the Lotte Rosenfeld that uses this line that signals some sort of order as being kind of crossed out and kind of somehow this bound disorder. So there could be an open way, or kind of a general way to say, yeah, these are women intervening into kind of a patriarchal and the kind of dictatorship position, but we may say that this is simply a very kind of political action. This is Patricia Restrepo. This is a Colombian artist who participated from a group in Colombia called Cine Mujer. That was a feminist cinema group. And I just wanted to use this example. This is a really beautiful film by this woman who, really the causes of the cinema group was to talk about violence, abortion, and a lot of kind of social issues. And she wanted to do this with a much more personal thing, which is based on a poem, but a poem called Prevet. And basically it's simply happening while a man drinks coffee, while he's completely indifferent to the woman he's sitting in front. So there is a moment where you see only the woman, a moment where you see the man, and a moment when you see both. There's different temporality. When the man drinks, he drinks really fast. When she's looking, her time really draws out. And basically, she had to actually step out of the feminist group because they considered that this was actually a way of showing the women in kind of weak women's ways of displaying their subjectivity, as opposed to kind of the principle of being strong and fighting. And she was saying, well, but feminism is also about defending this kind of more subjective, and sometimes I do feel weak. So, you know, the feminists themselves did not accept feminist art. And we have a great feminist theoretician in Guatemala who was disappeared when the Guatemalan Civil War happened, who actually was a super feminist, but she didn't believe in feminine art existed. So herself, she said, you know, art is not gender-based, it's a universal thing. And you have here Maria Vela Marmolejo and Sonia Gutierrez. Maria Vela, who is here somewhere in the room, from Colombia, and Sonia Gutierrez, these are from Colombia. Colombia, again, had the same issue. One of the main reasons why feminism wasn't the first issue that happened in Latin America is that most countries, to the except of Mexico, went through really horrific coup d'etats and kind of dictatorship regime and really kind of extensive moments of violence. So a lot of these women were really talking about this violence, but they were using their body to discuss these things. And so, for example, this is Brazil. Brazil, again, is another country. Clara Karilman, who is here, wrote a very interesting essay recently about Maiolino, Ligia Pape. And basically, I mean, some of these women in Brazil really kind of deny vehemently to be feminists. For them, I spoke recently with Sonia Andrade, who is here below, and she was saying, well, I wasn't a feminist, and I was really preoccupied about this kind of regime of terror that we were living, so her work is about this. So Whereas is a woman who is defined this kind of patriarchal system and this kind of dictatorial system, is this a feminist act or not? This, for example, Mexico didn't have the same oppressive, though there was also some problems, and there were much, and I think in Mexico they're much more overtly machist, and especially in the art world, men will say, oh yeah, women are not really good artists and so forth. So you have two, Monica Maya went to study at the Women's Building in Los Angeles, and then they were talking very openly about sexuality and about some of the kind of the myths, and they were using psychoanalysis and so forth. And this title says, sometimes my thoughts, I'm afraid of my own thoughts, from Monica Maya. And this is called Instrument of Work. To take away from Freud his macho side. So this is Ana Victoria Jimenez on this side. This is actually another one of the feminist artists from Mexico. She had a whole indexation of domestic labor things, and they're absolutely wonderful. Some are folding clothes, some are chopping vegetables and so forth, and it's very, this is not a very good image, but it's kind of very discarded. And then you have Liliana Darden, who is a Brazilian woman who was not interested in feminism, who had moved to a very kind of remote place in Brazil called Olinda, had been worried about the dictatorship the whole time. And these are about this kind of solitary work, about this kind of almost ritual approach to the idea of the daily work of cleaning. There is a kind of a gesture which is both violence and accepting at the same time. So it's kind of a slightly different thing. One is trying to depict the situation, the other one is trying to give it a little turn. This is, for example, Sophie Rivera on the left, who is an artist from Puerto Rico, who is based here, who actually defied one of your great photography curators, who was a very anti-women, what's called Sarkovsky. So she wrote a really brilliant article against him and the exclusion, and his kind of very kind of machist approach to women, and she defended women artists, and she did a whole series of balls where she has tampaxes or she has poo in them and so forth, and it's very kind of this thing about the more abject aspect of body. This is another one piece by Maria Vela Marmolejo in Colombia from 1982. Maria Vela was a person who actually had a different approach to sculpture, drawing and everything, ended up by being thrown out of school. And this is a ritual to the menstruation, so she will just kind of have pads all over her body, and then she will mark the wall with her blood and so forth. I mean, so these are gesture, but even Maria Vela Marmolejo, who you would think, she was a person that was critical about the kind of situation in which she had been raised, the fact that it was a violent society, had brothers who didn't have the same duties at home, but when she tried to approach the feminist group, they will just demand from her to be against men, and she didn't want to do that. So there was never really kind of a complete fit-in. For example, Eugenia Vargas, an artist from Chile, who until she was in Chile, she was never really involved in feminism. And then she went and moved to Chicago, studied, and then she finally felt free to talk about these issues. So she was defined these issues of the body, sexuality, and religiosity. Or someone like Yolanda Lopez. We've included, didn't make this comment. About 6 months ago, we decided to include Latina artists in our exhibition, which it is complicated because Latina women have been actually exposed to feminism, and there is a particular type of feminism that comes from Chicana artists, and Yolanda Lopez defies not only issues of images of women, but also race prejudice. And I wanted to show this last image, which is about, there's also all these women who somehow work on the idea and kind of are ironical about the idea of this construct, this kind of universal idea of art and the subject of women as a subject of art. This, for example, this Botticelli wash and wear. She will buy this kind of very, very cheap towel cloth and then just dye on them these kind of images of Botticelli, classic images, and then just kind of have them there. Or Regina Silveira, who will make all these biscuits for people to eat them. So anyhow, we could go on and on and on, but this is to give you an idea that feminism, for me, is really not a straightforward issue. And purposefully, I don't call our exhibition a feminist exhibition because I don't want to go and define someone as a feminist when they don't feel that they're feminist, even though there is so many coincidences with these principles of feminism. Thank you.